Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the channel. And today I'm going to go my review of WCW Slamboree 1993. Starting off the evening, we're going to go to our first match of the night. It's a tag team matchup. It is Too Cold Scorpio and Marcus Bagwell versus Bobby Eaton and Chris Benoit. Number one, I thought this was a good starting match for Slamboree 1993. Back and forth match between both teams with Too Cold Scorpio and Bagwell keeping the pace of the match. Eaton hits a knee drop off the top rope, but Too Cold Scorpio ultimately hits the finish, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Too Cold Scorpio and Marcus Bagwell. Hats off to Too Cold Scorpio and Marcus Bagwell for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. This was a glorified squash match. It's Sid Vicious versus Van Hammer. Like I said, glorified squash match with Sid Vicious ultimately hitting a devastating powerbomb on Van Hammer, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Sid Vicious. Hats off to Sid Vicious for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's kind of a Legends match, if you will. It is Dick Murdoch, Don Morocco, and Jimmy Superfly Snuka versus Wahoo McDaniel, Blackjack Mulligan, and Jim Brunzell. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Wahoo McDaniel, Blackjack Mulligan, and Jim Brunzell keeping the pace of the match. Don Morocco ultimately hits a power slam on Jim Brunzell, but this match ultimately ends in a no contest. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's another Legends match. It is Ivan Koloff and Baron Von Raschke versus Thunderbolt Patterson and Brad Armstrong. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Thunderbolt and Armstrong were keeping the pace of the match, with Thunderbolt ultimately hitting the finish, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Thunderbolt Patterson and Brad Armstrong. Hats off to Thunderbolt Patterson and Brad Armstrong for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's another Legends match. It is Dory Funk Jr. versus Nick Bockwinkel. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Funk and Bockwinkel with Dory Funk keeping the pace of the match. Dory Funk Jr. lands devastating uppercuts on Nick Bockwinkel in the middle of the ring. Bockwinkel ends up applying a figure 4 leg lock, but the hold is broke. And this match ultimately ends in a time limit draw. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It's another tag team matchup. It is Rick Rude and Paul Orndorff versus Dustin Rhodes and Kensuke Sasaki. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Rhodes and Sasaki keeping the pace of the match. Rhodes and Rude both exchange in the middle of the ring, with Rhodes hitting a tombstone pile driver on Rude in the middle of the ring. Sasaki then hits a press slam on Rude, but Rude ultimately hits a Rude Awakening, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are Rick Rude and Paul Orndorff. Hats off to Rick Rude and Paul Orndorff for getting the win in that matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the Prisoner versus Sting. I thought this was an okay match at best. Back and forth matchup between the Prisoner and Sting, with Sting keeping the pace of the match. Sting ultimately hits a clothesline off the top rope on the Prisoner, pins him for the 3, and your winner of the match is Sting. Hats off to Sting for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is a steel cage matchup for the WCW Tag Team Championships. It is Shane Douglas and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat versus the Hollywood Blondes. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between both teams with Ricky and Pillman exchanging in the middle of the ring. Ricky Steamboat and Shane Douglas were keeping the pace, but Austin ultimately hits his signature stun gun, pins for the 3, and your winners of the match are the Hollywood Blondes. Hats off to the Hollywood Blondes for getting the win in this matchup. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is Arn Anderson versus Barry Windham for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. I thought this was a good matchup as well. Back and forth matchup between Anderson and Windham, with Anderson keeping the pace of the match. Anderson hits a devastating DDT on Windham for a near fall. Windham then gets up, hits a DDT of his own on Anderson. Anderson then sends Windham into the rail. Windham is now busted wide open. Anderson then hits a knee drop on Windham. Windham gets up, hits a drop kick on Arn, sending Arn off the top rope to the outside. Windham then hits a clothesline off the top rope. Anderson then hits a spine buster on Wyndham. Anderson then pushes referee Randy Anderson. Wyndham ends up capitalizing on this, hits Arn Anderson with the belt with the referee being distracted. Pins for the 3, and your winner of the match, and still NWA World Heavyweight Champion, is Barry Windham. Hats off to Barry Windham for getting the win in that matchup and retaining at that time the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Moving on from that, we go into our next match of the night. It is the main event of Slamboree 1993. It is Vader versus the British Bulldog for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship. I thought this was a good matchup. Back and forth matchup between Vader and the British Bulldog. Vader ends up landing devastating strikes on the Bulldog. Harley Race then attacks the British Bulldog ringside. Vader then goes for a top rope maneuver on the Bulldog, but Bulldog counters it with a power slam. Bulldog then hits another power slam on Vader. British Bulldog then attacks Harley Race ringside, but Vader ultimately hits Bulldog with a chair shot. And your winner of the match by disqualification is the British Bulldog. A couple of things I want to say about Slamboree 1993, man, before I get out of here. Like I said many times before, this wasn't a bad event for WCW. Not the best, but not the worst. A couple matches on here that I did enjoy. Number one was the opening tag team matchup with 2 Cold Scorpio and Marcus Bagwell. Fantastic match, in my honest opinion. It was a really solid matchup to start Slamboree 1993. The other thing, too, was the legend matches on here. I was kind of apprehensive at first when I saw some of these legend matches because I didn't think they were going to be that good. But to be honest with you, with the 3 matches they put on for the Legends at Slamboree 1993, the best match that they booked for the Legends matches, in my honest opinion, was Dory Funk Jr. versus Nick Bockwinkel. The way that commentary was just setting this up throughout the entire match. Number one, the match ended in a time limit draw. And number two, the way they were hyping it up. I mean, you had Nick Bockwinkel completely being, you know, carrying on the lineage of the AWA. I mean, Nick Bockwinkel was the embodiment of AWA. Vern Gagne had a lot of respect for Nick Bockwinkel, former AWA world champion. I mean, hell, even in the match, Vern Gagne was, you know, standing ringside with Nick Bockwinkel, where you had Dory Funk Jr. and, you know, Gene Kiniski was sitting ringside for Dory Funk Jr. So, basically what I'm saying is that you had a dream match that never happened. You had AWA's Nick Bockwinkel, and then you had pretty much the NWA Dory Funk Jr. finally facing off years later after their career's pretty much almost over at this point. And to be honest with you, Dory Funk Jr. really held his own in this matchup, man. The guy looked like he never even retired. He was still going. I mean, he did a lot of really good moves in that matchup. And I kind of wish we got a concrete, winner in that match, man. It was a time limit draw, but for a Legends match, man, it was absolutely fantastic. Arn Anderson versus Barry Windham for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship was a solid matchup. And I stated this multiple times in the past as well. Arn Anderson is one of those guys where could he have been multi-time world champion? Absolutely. With the amount of in-ring ability that the guy has, I mean, the spine buster is legendary, the DDT is legendary. Arn Anderson can wrestle, and he's severely underrated. Now, the problem with him not being World Heavyweight Champion multiple times is not the lack of charisma, the lack of build. I don't think, and it goes for, same thing with Tully Blanchard. It's not like you can build Tully Blanchard as a World Heavyweight Champion. They all have charisma, and part of the, if not the greatest stable in professional wrestling of all time, being the Four Horsemen. But they weren't a Ric Flair. Ric Flair had the charisma. He had the athletic prowess to do what he needed to do. He was a great in-ring performer, multi-time world champion, I believe 16-time world heavyweight champion, and somebody that a company could build around, around that, individual. And that's exactly what WCW did with Rick as well as NWA. It was kind of hard for Arn Anderson to get that, spotlight or exposure as a singles competitor and not be teaming up with Tully or not being a part of the Four Horsemen. Now, was he, champions? Was he a television champion? Sure. Was he a multi-time tag team champion? Absolutely. But, the thing with Arn Anderson, there was always going to be a stigma with Arn no matter what he did in his career, that he was always going to be surrounded by Ric Flair and the Four Horsemen. Where Rick, yeah, obviously his, one of the main guys in the Four Horsemen, the leader, in my opinion, of the Four Horsemen. But when Flair separated himself from Arn, Tully, Windham, and J.J. Dillon, it wasn't like, oh, you had the Four Horsemen, stigma around Ric Flair. It was always there, but Flair went on to have, a singles run away from the Four Horsemen and went on to have a fabulous career. I mean, awesome career. Legendary career. Where Arn, it's more or less, okay, well, yeah, he had a singles run, but he's always going to be known for being a part of the Horsemen, the Enforcer, teaming up with Tully Blanchard. That was always going to be the stigma of Arn Anderson no matter what. But as far as, in-ring ability, athleticism, and stuff like that, Arn Anderson definitely could have been a multi-time world champion, in my honest opinion. It's kind of the same thing with Ron Simmons. And it's a perfect example. Ron Simmons, to me, was always a tag team wrestler guy. Whether he was teaming with Butch Reed as a part of Doom, which I thought was a severely underrated tag team, those two guys were powerhouses. With, Ron Simmons and Butch Reed being on the same tag team together. Absolutely incredible. And then, obviously, when he got into WWE and the Attitude Era, him teaming up with Bradshaw as the APA, the Acolytes, he was always better as a tag team. Now, did he have a singles run? Absolutely. Was he a world champion? Yeah, Ron Simmons was. A lot of people don't remember that, but Ron Simmons was a world champion for WCW. But, again, his career is always going to be surrounded by him being in a tag team and not a singles competitor. Same thing with Arn Anderson. Arn has held championships like the television championship and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, everybody's going to remember Arn Anderson being tag team partners with Tully Blanchard or being a part of the Four Horsemen, not his singles run and just Arn Anderson doing his own thing. It's the same thing with Ron Simmons. Not a lot of people remember him winning the WCW World Championship back in the day, but a lot of people remember Ron Simmons of being, teaming up with Bradshaw with the APA, teaming up with Butch Reed and Doom, or hell, even a part of the Nation of Domination when he was teaming up with guys like D'Lo Brown, Karma, and The Rock, with being the Nation of Domination in the Attitude Era. So it wasn't like his, singles career was the greatest of all time. Some people, they start from stables and they go to have a, fantastic career, like The Rock. The Rock got into the business with WWE, starting out pretty much, or got his exposure, if you will, working with guys like Ron Simmons, D'Lo Brown, and Kama. Being a part of the Nation of Domination, that really got his name out there. That's my only thing about Arn, man. Arn is severely underrated. In my honest opinion, could have been a multi-time world champion, but I just feel like it was never going to happen because he was always going to be part of a tag team and the stigma of the Four Horsemen, and he really can't build an entire show around Arn Anderson, which is a shame. Also, the main event, Vader versus British Bulldog, awesome match, legendary match. And to be honest with you, a lot of people are not fans of the British Bulldog, man. I was a huge fan growing up watching the British Bulldog, man. The guy can wrestle. Now, obviously, a lot of people were like, oh, well, he's a part of the Hart Foundation, stuff like that, being a part of the, Hart family. I don't think that makes a damn difference, in my honest opinion, man. The British Bulldog was severely underrated. And he was one of the best tag teams of all time, in my honest opinion, when he was teaming up with the Dynamite Kid as the British Bulldogs. They were a phenomenal tag team and multi-time tag team champions, if I'm not mistaken. So, to see him have a singles run, and again, it goes, well, what I just said about Ron Simmons and, Arn Anderson. When British Bulldog did his own thing, he was European champion. He was Intercontinental champion. Was he ever World Heavyweight champion? No. Because you probably can't build a show around him being World Heavyweight champion. Did he deserve it? Absolutely. I mean, one of his biggest matches, if not his biggest match of all time for the British Bulldog, was the match that he had against Bret the Hitman Hart for the Intercontinental Championship live in England. And it was huge. I believe it was SummerSlam, years and years ago. It was a sold-out show. I mean, it was awesome. And the crowd erupted when he beat Bret for the Intercontinental Championship. It was fantastic. But, again, he's another guy that's, could he have been multi-time world champion? Absolutely. He definitely had the athletic ability, definitely had the charisma. But can you build a show around the British Bulldog, Davey Boy Smith? I don't know. I feel like a lot of guys, because of that, get overlooked. And I said this before a long time ago as well, man. Look at a guy like Mr. Perfect. Mr. Perfect or Roddy Piper. Roddy Piper could have been a multi-time world champion, one of the greatest heels in the business. Never really world champion, especially for WWE. Never happened. And then you look at Mr. Perfect, like I just said, one of the greatest, if not the greatest Intercontinental champion of all time. In my honest opinion, I mean, Mr. Perfect is definitely up there as far as being some of the greatest Intercontinental champions of all time. He had the charisma, he had the athletic ability, he was a perfect package, man. He really was. But was he ever world champion? No, he was not. You know, and a lot of guys get overshadowed because of that, and it's just a damn shame. But, you know, the main event was a really good main event. Vader versus British Bulldog, with Bulldog getting the win by disqualification due to a chair shot. All in all, I mean, like I said, man, Slamboree 1993, it wasn't the best event, but it damn sure was not the worst. There was definitely some flaws in this pay-per-view, like number one, Sid Vicious versus Van Hammer. It was a glorified squash match, and I just wasn't a big fan of it. Prisoner versus Sting, I thought was absolutely horrendous. I don't know why they booked that. It was god-awful. Those two matches, man, I just wasn't a big fan of. But other than that, it was a decent card. And not only that, the Legends matches were also amazing as well. Seeing Dory Funk Jr. versus Nick Bockwinkel is a legendary matchup. And both those guys went for a full, I think it was 30 minutes. That's saying a lot. You know, being legends at that point in their career and going a full 30 minutes in that match is absolutely incredible, man. And the match to end in a time limit draw says a lot. Says an absolute hell of a lot. But as far as Slamboree 1993, as far as a rating is concerned, I do this with every single pay-per-view that I see and I watch. I give it a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the greatest and 1 being just horrendous. Slamboree 1993, man, I'm going to give it a solid 4 at best, maybe a 4.5 at best, because there's a lot of things I didn't like about this card, but there's things I did like about this card, like the main event. Arn Anderson versus Barry Windham for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. It was a decent event at best. So I'm going to have to give Slamboree 1993 a solid 4.5 at best. But this is my review of WCW Slamboree 1993. I hope you guys are out there staying safe. Be careful, and remember, stay classic. Peace.